Hey guys! Tonight we are stepping into the tangled and quietly anguished world of illicit love in medieval Europe, where the Church's iron grip on marriage, the cold pragmatism of feudal contract, and the private longings of real human hearts collided in ways that were at once deeply ordinary and profoundly consequential. In the villages of 13th century France and the great stone manors of England, in the candle-lit scriptoriums where monks recorded the scandals of their age, and in the muddy market squares where gossip moved faster than horses, love that fell outside the sanctioned boundaries of matrimony was not merely a private sorrow. It was a legal matter, a spiritual crisis, a social catastrophe, and sometimes a death sentence. Tonight, we will spend a long and unhurried time inside that world, examining the precise legal and ecclesiastical frameworks that governed medieval marriage, the very specific ways in which loving a married person could destroy a life, and the documented stories of men and women who found themselves caught between genuine feeling and an institutional structure that regarded their hearts as entirely irrelevant. We will look at canon law and manorial courts, at the role of the parish priest and the bishop's tribunal, at the lives of women particularly, whose legal standing was so fragile that a single misstep could unravel everything they had. But we will move slowly and carefully through centuries of evidence, and by the end, you will understand not just the rules of medieval love, but the full weight of what it cost to break them. Marriage in medieval Europe from roughly the 5th century through to the close of the 15th century was almost never primarily a matter of personal feeling, romantic attachment, or mutual desire between two individuals who had freely chosen one another. It was instead a legal instrument, a property arrangement, a mechanism of social alliance, a theological sacrament, and, particularly among the nobility and the emerging merchant classes, a carefully negotiated contract between families, and estates, lords, and sometimes kings. Understanding this fundamental reality is essential before we can begin to understand why loving a married person in medieval Europe was so uniquely catastrophic, because the consequences flowed not merely from jealousy or personal betrayal, but from a vast and interlocking system of law, theology, economics, and social expectation that treated marriage as something far larger and far more consequential than the union of two private hearts. Tonight, that we will move through the full terrain of this subject with care and thoroughness. We will begin by examining how medieval marriage actually worked, who arranged it, who benefited from it, and what legal and spiritual weight it carried under both secular and ecclesiastical law. From there we will look at what canon law, which was the law of the Church as administered by bishops, archbishops, and ultimately the papacy in Rome, had to say about adultery, concubinage, and illicit unions. But we will examine the social and legal penalties that could befall those who loved unwisely, the specific vulnerabilities of women, the extraordinary hypocrisy that existed between noble behaviour and the Church's stated ideals, and the remarkable and often heartbreaking documented cases that survive in court records, chronicles, and letters from the period. Before we begin that journey, a quiet and sincere word of thanks to everyone watching tonight. If you find this kind of calm, detailed historical content a gentle companion for sleep or study, a like or a share is always warmly appreciated, and subscribing to the channel helps many more people discover this kind of peaceful historical exploration. We are always glad to hear in the comments which topics you would most love to explore next, and we do genuinely wonder where in the world you are watching from tonight, and what hour it is as you settle in. Now let us begin quietly and without haste. The very beginning of this story, the institution of medieval marriage, law, theology, and property. To understand the particular suffering of anyone who fell in love with a married person in medieval Europe, we must first understand, in precise and thorough detail, exactly what marriage was during this period, because it was not what we might instinctively imagine it to be. Marriage in the medieval world was not a simple personal covenant between two people who had chosen one another, and as it was a layered and complex institution governed simultaneously by the secular law of lords and kings, the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, the customary law of local communities, and the deeply pragmatic logic of land, inheritance, and social status. Each of these systems placed enormous weight on the permanence and sanctity of the marital bond, and each of them, in its own way, made the position of anyone who transgressed that bond extraordinarily precarious. The theological framework for medieval Christian marriage had been developing steadily since the earliest centuries of the Church, drawing on the letters of Paul, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the gradual institutional consolidation of canon law into a more formal system. By the 12th century, the Church had arrived at a remarkably precise theological position on what marriage actually was. At the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, convened under Pope Innocent III in Rome in November of that year, the Church formally codified many of its expectations around marriage, including the requirement that marriages be publicly announced in advance, a practice we now recognise as the reading of the banns, which was designed specifically to allow any person with knowledge of an impediment to the union to come forward before the ceremony took place. The impediments that canon law recognised were numerous and specific. They included the impediment of prior marriage, which meant that no person who was already validly married could contract a second marriage without the first having been properly dissolved or annulled. This impediment was, for our purposes tonight, among the most significant, because it established with absolute legal clarity that the marriage bond, once validly formed, could not simply be abandoned or set aside because one of the parties had developed feelings for someone else. The question of what made a marriage valid was itself a subject of considerable debate throughout the medieval period, and understanding that debate helps us understand the particular vulnerability of those who became entangled with someone already bound to another. The great theologian and canon lawyer Peter Lombard, writing in Paris in the middle of the 12th century in his influential work known as The Sentences, had argued that the consent of the two parties alone was sufficient to create a valid marriage, even in the absence of witnesses, a priest, or any public ceremony. His contemporary, the canon lawyer Gratian, whose decretum compiled around 1140 in Bologna was the foundational text of medieval canon law, took a somewhat different position, arguing that consent alone was insufficient and that consummation was also required for a marriage to be fully binding. The Church eventually arrived at a compromise position that blended these views, holding that consent created a valid but incomplete marriage, and that consummation then made that marriage indissoluble in the fullest sense. The practical consequence of this for ordinary medieval people was enormous, because it meant that a marriage could be contracted quite informally, perhaps with nothing more than spoken words of consent exchanged privately between two people, and yet still be regarded by canon law as a binding and permanent union. If a person had exchanged such words with one person and then developed a relationship with another, they were, in the eyes of the Church, committing adultery, regardless of whether they had ever stood before a priest or signed any document. The secular dimension of medieval marriage operated alongside and sometimes in tension with the ecclesiastical framework. Among the nobility, the marriage was primarily a mechanism for the transfer and consolidation of land and political alliance. When a lord arranged the marriage of his daughter to the son of a neighbouring baron in, say, the county of Champagne in the year 1180, the primary concern was not the happiness of the young people involved, but the terms of the dower, the dowry, the jointure, and the inheritance rights that would flow from the union. The dower, at which was the portion of the husband's estate to which the wife was entitled if she survived him, was typically set at 1/3 of his lands at the time of marriage. The dowry which the bride's family contributed might consist of cash, lands, or movable goods of considerable value. These arrangements were set down in written contracts, sometimes extremely detailed ones, and witnessed by representatives of both families and often by the local lord himself. And once such a contract had been executed and the marriage solemnized, the property implications were immediate and permanent. A wife who abandoned the marital household, or a husband who took up with another woman in a way that threatened the legitimate inheritance of his children, was not merely causing personal unhappiness. They were threatening a property arrangement that might involve the interests of dozens of people across multiple generations. And moving forward in our exploration of this remarkable period, it is worth pausing for a moment to consider how the combination of ecclesiastical permanence and secular property logic created a trap that was genuinely inescapable for most medieval people who found themselves loving someone they could not have. The church would not dissolve a valid marriage, and secular law would not ignore the property consequences of marital breakdown. The institution was designed from every angle and to be permanent, and the human feelings of the people caught inside it were simply not considered a relevant variable. As we turn now to the specific legal machinery of canon law, we will begin to see exactly how those feelings were treated when they came into conflict with the institution. Canon law and the architecture of marital permanence. Canon law, the legal system of the medieval Roman Catholic Church, was not a vague or aspirational set of moral guidelines. It was a highly sophisticated, extensively documented, and actively enforced body of law that governed the personal and spiritual lives of every Christian in Western Europe, from the most powerful king to the most obscure serf. By the high medieval period, the 12th and 13th centuries in particular, canon law had developed its own courts, its own judges, its own appellate structure, and its own system of penalties, and it took the regulation of marriage with extraordinary seriousness. For anyone who found themselves in love with a married person, canon law was not a distant abstraction. It was a system that could, and frequently did, reach directly into their lives with consequences ranging from public humiliation and financial penalty to excommunication from the church and, in extreme cases, imprisonment. The foundational principle of canon law's treatment of marriage was the doctrine of indissolubility, which held that a valid, consummated Christian marriage could not be dissolved by any human authority. This doctrine had its roots in the words attributed to Christ in the Gospel of Matthew, where remarriage after divorce was characterized as adultery, and it had been elaborated and defended by theologians and canon lawyers across the centuries since. By the 12th century, the doctrine had become so firmly established that even the most powerful rulers in Christendom found it nearly impossible to escape a marriage they found inconvenient. The most famous example is perhaps that of King Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus, who in August of 1193 married Ingeborg of Denmark in the Cathedral of Amiens, only to repudiate her the very next morning, claiming an inexplicable physical aversion to her. Philip spent the next 20 years attempting to obtain an annulment, married another woman, Agnes of Marennia, in June of 1196, and was eventually placed under papal interdict, meaning that all church services in France were suspended in 1200 because of his refusal to take Ingeborg back. The episode illustrates with striking clarity how seriously the church enforced the principle of marital permanence even against a king, and it helps us imagine the hopelessness of the situation for ordinary people with far less power and far fewer resources to mount a legal challenge. Canon law did, it should be noted, provide one escape route from an unwanted marriage, and that was the declaration of nullity, which is often incorrectly referred to as an annulment in popular usage, though strictly speaking the declaration of nullity was a finding that no valid marriage had ever existed, rather than a dissolution of an existing one. The grounds on which nullity could be declared were specific and limited. They included the discovery of a prior existing marriage on the part of one of the parties, the existence of a blood relationship within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity, which extended to the fourth degree of kinship in the system established by the Fourth Lateran Council, the discovery that one of the parties had previously made a solemn religious vow of chastity, the finding that the marriage had been contracted through force or fear, or the determination that the parties were related by spiritual affinity, meaning that one had stood as godparent to the other or to the other's child. Each of these grounds required formal proof presented before an ecclesiastical court, and the process was expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain in its outcome. For a wealthy nobleman or a prosperous merchant, such a process was difficult but not impossible. For a serf, a village artisan, or a minor tradesman, it was effectively out of reach. The ecclesiastical courts that adjudicated marriage cases in medieval Europe were organised in a hierarchical structure that mirrored the structure of the church itself. At the local level, the bishop's court, known as the consistory court, handled most routine marriage matters, including cases of alleged adultery, bigamy, and illicit unions. More complex or contentious cases could be appealed to the archiepiscopal court, and ultimately to the Roman rota, which was the supreme appellate court of the papacy in Rome. The personnel of these courts included trained canon lawyers, notaries who recorded the proceedings, and episcopal officials known as officials or officials who presided as judges. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, and the records that survive from many of these courts provide an extraordinarily detailed window into the marital lives of medieval people at every level of society. The penalties available to the canonical courts for marital transgressions were carefully graduated according to the severity of the offence. Simple fornication between unmarried people was relatively minor, and typically resulted in a penance assigned by the priest or a small monetary penalty payable to the church. Adultery, meaning sexual relations by a married person with someone other than their spouse, or sexual relations with a married person by someone who knew them to be married, and was considerably more serious and could result in mandatory penance, public humiliation in the form of being required to process through the parish in a white sheet while carrying a candle, separation from the adulterous partner, and, in cases of persistent, unrepentant adultery, excommunication from the church. Excommunication was not merely a religious penalty in the medieval context. It was a civic and social catastrophe because an excommunicated person was cut off from the sacraments and could not make a valid will, could not bring a case before an ecclesiastical court, and was treated by fellow Christians as a spiritual outcast. In a society where the church touched every aspect of life from birth to death, excommunication was as close to civil death as the medieval legal system could impose. Let us now turn our attention carefully to the specific social position of the woman who found herself in love with a married man, because the consequences she faced were in many respects more severe and more inescapable than those faced by her male counterpart, and understanding that asymmetry is essential to understanding the full texture of the history we are examining tonight. The woman's position, legal vulnerability, and social ruin. It is particularly worth noting that the medieval legal system, both in its ecclesiastical and its secular dimensions, treated men and women who transgressed the boundaries of marriage in ways that were profoundly and deliberately unequal. A married man who took a mistress occupied a position of considerable social ambiguity. His behaviour was technically sinful under canon law, and could, in theory, result in canonical penalties. But in practice, particularly among the nobility and the upper levels of the merchant class, it was tolerated, understood as a fairly ordinary male failing, and rarely resulted in any serious social consequence for the man himself. The same behaviour on the part of a woman, and whether she was the wife who strayed or the unmarried woman who became involved with a married man, was treated with an entirely different degree of severity and disgust, and the consequences could be life-altering in the most irreversible ways. To understand why this was so, we need to understand the legal status of women in medieval Europe with some precision. Under the secular law of most medieval European societies, a married woman occupied a legal position known as coverture, derived from the Norman French term meaning to cover or to hide. Under coverture, the legal identity of the wife was, in the eyes of the law, absorbed into that of her husband. She could not own property independently, could not make contracts in her own name, could not bring a lawsuit without her husband's and had no independent legal standing in most secular courts. Her person, her property, and her children were, in the legal sense, her husband's. This meant that if she engaged in an adulterous relationship and her husband chose to repudiate her, she lost everything at once: her home, her children, her property, her social standing, and her legal identity, in a single stroke. The practical consequences of a wife's adultery being discovered were documented in considerable detail in the legal records and chronicles of the period. Under the custom of many medieval European regions, a husband who discovered his wife in the act of adultery had, in some jurisdictions, a legal right to kill both his wife and her lover on the spot, a right that was recognised in the customary law of some parts of France and in various Germanic legal codes. The Salic law, which governed the Frankish peoples and influenced legal practice across a wide area of medieval Europe, treated adultery by a wife as one of the most serious offences in its catalogue, reflecting the overriding concern with paternity and legitimate inheritance. A woman found guilty of adultery in a secular court could be subject to physical punishment, including flogging, mutilation of the nose or ears in some regional customs, confiscation of her dowry, and permanent loss of her children. The children born of an adulterous union were, under most medieval legal frameworks, illegitimate, meaning they had no claim to inherit their putative father's estate and were in a legally and socially marginalised position for the remainder of their lives. The canon law treatment of the adulterous wife was, in some respects, slightly more measured than the harshest secular customs, because the Church was committed to the principle that both parties to an adulterous act had sinned, and that neither party's sin was simply erased by the others. The canonists argued that a husband did not have the right to simply murder his wife upon discovering her adultery, and various papal decretals from the 12th and 13th centuries attempted to limit the right of private vengeance that secular law sometimes permitted. However, canonical courts did permit a husband to pursue a formal separation from bed and board, known in Latin as separatio a mensa et thoro, from the phrase meaning from the table and the bed, on the grounds of his wife's adultery. This separation did not dissolve the marriage, meaning neither party could remarry, but it did allow the husband to remove the wife from his household and to cease providing her with financial support. The wife, separated and unsupported, with no independent legal standing and no right to her dowry or her children, was left in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. The woman who loved a married man from the outside, that is, the unmarried woman who entered into a relationship with a man already bound to another wife, faced a somewhat different but equally bleak set of consequences. Canon law described such a woman as a concubine if the relationship was ongoing and acknowledged, or as a fornicatrix if it was more casual or hidden, and both designations carried significant social and legal stigma. In a society where a woman's marriageability was her primary economic asset, a reputation for unchastity was devastating, and no respectable family would accept such a woman as a wife for their son. Her chances of making the kind of marriage that would provide her with security, status, and legal protection were effectively destroyed. If she became pregnant by her married lover, the child was illegitimate, and she was left to provide for it without legal recourse against the father, whose obligation under law was primarily to his legitimate wife and children. The ecclesiastical courts could, in theory, require the father to contribute to the child's maintenance, but in practice this was difficult to enforce and rarely resulted in more than token payments. As we delve deeper into this complex and layered subject, it is worth considering the specific circumstances of women in the lower social strata, the peasant women and the wives of tradesmen and craftsmen, whose stories are less often recorded in the chronicles of the period, but whose experiences were in some ways the most raw and unmediated. A peasant woman who became involved with the married lord of her manor, for example, occupied a position of particular powerlessness because she had no legal recourse against him, no social standing to invoke in her defence, and no means of escaping the village community in which she lived. We will return to this specific dynamic when we examine the feudal structure in greater detail, but it is worth establishing here that the vulnerability of women to the consequences of illicit love was not uniform across social classes. It was, in every case, severe, but the specific form it took and the specific resources available to the woman to navigate it varied considerably depending on her social position and the support or lack of support available to her from her own family. The Church's double standard, noble hypocrisy, and official condemnation. There is something deeply revealing in the gap between what the medieval Church officially taught about marital fidelity and what it was willing to tolerate in practice, particularly among the powerful, and examining that gap carefully gives us one of the most illuminating perspectives on the true social reality of illicit love in the medieval period. The official teaching of the Church was unambiguous. Marriage was a sacrament instituted by God. Adultery was a mortal sin that could, if unconfessed and unrepented, result in eternal damnation, and the sexual union of a man and a woman was licit only within the confines of a valid marriage. These were not ambiguous or provisional statements. They were the formal theological positions of the Church, repeated in sermons, confessors' manuals, penitential handbooks, and the documents of church councils across the entire medieval period. And yet the nobility of medieval Europe maintained a tradition of extramarital relationships that was so normalised as to be almost institutionalised. The great magnates of the period, the counts, dukes, and kings whose courts set the tone for aristocratic culture, routinely kept mistresses with a degree of openness that suggested they saw no fundamental contradiction between their public Christian piety and their private sexual arrangements. King Henry I of England, who reigned from 1100 to 1135, is reliably recorded in the chronicles of his reign to have fathered at least 20 illegitimate children by a succession of mistresses, and making him one of the most prolifically adulterous monarchs in English history. William of Malmesbury, the chronicler writing in the 1120s, records these relationships with a tone that is more admiring of Henry's vigour than censorious of his morality. King Philip I of France, who reigned from 1060 to 1108, had his marriage to Bertha of Holland declared invalid on highly dubious grounds in order to take up with Bertray de Montfort, who was herself already married to Fulk IV of Anjou. Pope Urban II excommunicated Philip for this arrangement in 1094, but the excommunication was repeatedly lifted and reimposed over the following years in a manner that suggested the papacy was more interested in Philip's political cooperation than in the strict enforcement of marital law. The royal courts of medieval Europe were, and in a sense, the most visible demonstration of the double standard that pervaded the Church's treatment of marital transgression. At the same time that bishops were imposing public penances on peasants and townspeople caught in adulterous relationships, the great lords and kings were maintaining acknowledged mistresses with little practical consequence. The children of these relationships, though technically illegitimate, were sometimes raised openly in the royal or noble household, given lands and titles, and treated as part of the extended aristocratic family. William the Conqueror himself was the illegitimate son of Robert I of Normandy, and his Norman background gave rise to the somewhat sardonic sobriquet William the Bastard, which his enemies used to remind him of his origins, and yet his illegitimacy did not prevent him from inheriting the Duchy of Normandy and eventually conquering England in 1066. This particular example illustrates the way in which illegitimacy among the nobility, while legally and theologically significant, was in practice a much more negotiable category than it was for the common people. The Church's response to this aristocratic tolerance of adultery was inconsistent and often politically motivated. When a powerful lord's extramarital arrangements directly threatened the Church's institutional interests, when they involved disputed inheritances that might affect Church property, for example, or when they became a cause of scandal so public that silence became impossible, the Church was capable of firm action. But in the ordinary run of aristocratic life, the Church's officials, who were themselves often members of noble families, tended to turn a careful and deliberate blind eye. The same bishop who might order a peasant woman to do public penance for fornication would receive the illegitimate son of a neighbouring earl as a student in his cathedral school without comment. This structural hypocrisy was not lost on contemporaries. The satirical literature of the 12th and 13th centuries is full of biting commentary on the gap between clerical preaching and aristocratic practice, and some of the most pointed satire came from within the Church itself. It is also worth noting that the Church's own clergy were far from immune to the temptations of illicit love. Despite the formal requirement of clerical celibacy, which had been reinforced with particular vigour by the Gregorian reform movement of the 11th century, the reality of medieval clerical life was that a very large number of priests, particularly at the parish level, maintained long-term relationships with women who are known in the records as facaria, a term that literally meant hearth-woman and euphemistically described what were in practice common-law wives. The children of these relationships were known as priests' bastards, and while canon law regarded their existence as a scandal, the practical reality was that in many rural parishes the priest's partner was a familiar and accepted figure in the community, performing many of the practical domestic and sometimes pastoral functions that a wife would have performed. The reforming councils of the 12th and 13th centuries repeatedly condemned these arrangements and ordered priests to send their partners away, but the evidence from visitation records suggests that compliance was uneven at best, and that in many areas the practice continued with remarkable persistence well into the later medieval period. As we move forward in our exploration of this subject, let us now turn our attention carefully to the very specific legal and social mechanisms through which a person who loved a married partner could be brought before a court, subjected to examination, and made to face the full consequences of the institutional disapproval of their relationship. And before the court, how adulterous relationships were discovered and prosecuted. The medieval ecclesiastical court system was not a passive institution that waited for formal complaints to be brought before it. In the high and later medieval periods, it operated through a mechanism of active inquiry known as the visitation, in which the bishop or his representative would travel periodically through the diocese and systematically question local clergy and lay people about the moral condition of their communities. These visitations were not gentle conversations, they were structured examinations conducted under oath, in which local people were asked directly whether they knew of anyone in their parish who was living in adultery, maintaining a concubine, engaging in fornication with a married person, and or otherwise transgressing the church's sexual regulations. The records of these visitations, many of which survive in diocesan archives across France, England, Germany and Italy, provide an extraordinary and sometimes startling window into the actual sexual lives of medieval people, and the mechanisms by which those lives were policed. The process by which an individual came before the ecclesiastical court on a charge of adultery or illicit union typically followed one of two paths. The first was the formal accusation, in which a specific person, most often the injured spouse, but sometimes a concerned neighbour or a parish priest, brought a formal written complaint before the bishop's court identifying the alleged offenders and stating the nature of the offence. The second was the process known as denunciation by public fame or fama, which meant that the court could open an investigation against someone if there was sufficient general reputation in the community that they had committed an offence, even if no specific individual had formally accused them. This second mechanism was particularly powerful because it meant that the mere widespread gossip of a village or a town could be sufficient to drag someone before a court and compel them to answer questions about their private behaviour. Once a case was before the court, the accused was required to appear in person and to answer the charges. If they denied the accusation, they could be required to undergo the process of compurgation, which meant that they had to produce a specified number of oath helpers, typically between 12 and 36, depending on the gravity of the charge, who were willing to swear formally that they believed the accused to be telling the truth and to be of good moral character. This was not simply a matter of finding a few friendly acquaintances willing to say kind things. The oath helpers were swearing on their own immortal souls, and the perjury of an oath helper was itself a serious canonical offence. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, finding 12 people willing to swear to the good character of someone widely believed to be sleeping with a married neighbour could be genuinely difficult or impossible. The failure of compurgation, meaning the inability to find sufficient oath helpers, was treated as an admission of guilt by the court. The physical staging of canonical court proceedings was designed in part to maximise the public humiliation and social pressure on the accused. Cases were typically heard in the local church or in a room attached to the bishop's palace, in the presence of the court's officials, the notary recording the proceedings, and often a substantial audience of curious observers. The accused would stand before the officiating judge and be questioned directly. In cases involving adultery, the questioning could be extremely specific, covering the number of occasions on which the illicit relationship had taken place, the locations in which it had occurred, who had witnessed it, and whether the accused had previously been warned to desist. The answers were recorded in Latin in the court register, and those registers, and many of which survive in excellent condition, allow us to reconstruct the proceedings in remarkable detail. The penalties available to the ecclesiastical court upon a finding of guilt in an adultery case were carefully graded and designed to combine spiritual correction with public shaming. For a first offence, the typical penalty was a combination of formal penance and a public demonstration of contrition. The offender might be required to stand at the church door on a specified number of Sundays and holy days, wearing only a white linen sheet and carrying a lighted candle, confessing their sin to the congregation as it entered for the service. This ceremony was known as standing penance, and its public nature was entirely deliberate, in a society without newspapers, that the standing penance was the closest equivalent to a published announcement of the offender's sin, and it was extraordinarily effective as a means of social stigmatization. For more serious or persistent offenders, the penalties escalated to exclusion from the church, denial of communion, and ultimately excommunication. The secular courts also played a role in the prosecution of marital transgressions, and their involvement added another dimension of legal jeopardy to the position of those who loved unwisely. In England, the manorial courts that operated under the authority of local lords dealt with many aspects of the lives of the peasant population, and the records of these courts include numerous cases involving sexual misconduct. The offence known as lairwite, and which was recorded in the court rolls of many English manors from the 13th century onward, was a fine paid to the lord by an unfree woman, a serf or villain, who had engaged in sexual relations outside marriage. The existence of lairwite is significant because it demonstrates that even at the very lowest levels of medieval society, illicit sexual behaviour was regarded as a matter for legal intervention and financial penalty, not merely as a private moral failing. The lord's economic interest in his serfs extended to their sexual behaviour, because an illegitimate pregnancy could affect the serf woman's capacity to perform her labour obligations, and created a child of uncertain legal status who might become a burden on the lord's estate. As we turn now to examine the specific experience of the man who loved a married woman, but we will find a set of consequences that, while in many respects less severe than those faced by women, were nonetheless sufficiently serious to make the position of such a man genuinely uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. The man who loved another man's wife. Honour, violence, and legal consequence. The man who fell in love with a married woman in the medieval Europe found himself navigating a set of social and legal dangers that were, in important ways, different from those faced by the woman who loved a married man, but no less real and no less potentially devastating. While canon law treated both male and female adultery as equally sinful in principle, the social and secular legal frameworks surrounding marital honour were deeply shaped by assumptions about masculine authority, property rights over women's bodies, and the paramount importance of guaranteeing the legitimacy of a man's heirs. A wife's sexual fidelity was, in the medieval legal and social imagination, primarily a matter of property and inheritance rather than of personal morality, and the man who threatened that fidelity was, in the eyes of the injured husband and his community, threatening something as fundamental as his property rights and his bloodline. The concept of honour in medieval European society, particularly among the nobility and the knightly class, was not merely a matter of personal pride or social reputation in the modern sense. It was a legal and practical reality with direct material consequences. A nobleman's honour, his right to be treated with the respect and deference appropriate to his rank, was tied directly to the honour of his household, and the honour of his household was tied directly to the sexual purity of his wife. A man who was cuckolded, which is to say a man whose wife had been sexually unfaithful, was an object of mockery and contempt in the social world of medieval Europe in a way that could directly undermine his authority, his relationships with his peers and vassals, and his practical ability to exercise the power and influence that his rank was supposed to confer. The cuckold was a stock figure of ridicule in medieval literature and popular culture, appearing in fabliaux, the ribald comic tales that circulated in French-speaking areas from the 12th century onward, and in the broader tradition of misogynistic comedy that ran through medieval popular culture. This cultural ridicule was not innocent or harmless. It reflected and reinforced a social reality in which a man whose wife was known to have been unfaithful suffered genuine and practical consequences in his social world. The man who was discovered to have been sleeping with another man's wife could face consequences that ranged from formal legal proceedings to direct physical violence. Under the customary law of many medieval regions, the injured husband had a legal right to respond to discovered adultery with immediate physical force. The fuero, or customary law of various Spanish medieval kingdoms, explicitly permitted a husband to kill both his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act, provided he killed both of them and not merely one, and a provision designed to prevent a husband from using the adultery laws as a pretext for murdering a wife he wished to be rid of, while sparing a lover who might be too powerful to safely harm. Similar provisions existed in the customary laws of parts of France and in various Germanic legal codes. Even in areas where such outright killing was not legally sanctioned, the physical assault of a man caught sleeping with one's wife was treated by many courts with a leniency that effectively communicated social acceptance of the violent response. Beyond the immediate physical danger, the man who loved a married woman faced the possibility of formal legal action by the husband in the ecclesiastical courts. A husband could bring an action for adultery against both his wife and her lover, and if the charge was proven, then the lover could be subjected to the same range of canonical penalties as the wife herself, including public penance and, in serious cases, excommunication. The husband could also, in some jurisdictions, bring a civil action against the lover for the injury done to his honour and to the legitimacy of his household. And courts in certain areas recognised the concept of monetary compensation for this kind of injury. In the secular courts of some German-speaking regions, a formal tradition existed by which the injured husband could challenge his wife's lover to a judicial combat, a formal organised duel, to resolve the matter through physical contest. And it is also worth noting that the social consequences for a man discovered in an adulterous relationship with a married woman depended heavily on the relative social status of the parties involved. If the woman's husband was a more powerful man than her lover, the consequences for the lover could be extremely serious, because the husband could bring the full weight of his social, legal, and political influence to bear against someone who had a diminished capacity to resist. There are documented cases in the chronicles of the period in which powerful lords used the discovery of adultery involving their wives as a pretext for the destruction of a rival or an enemy, pursuing the prosecution of the alleged lover with a vigour that owed as much to political calculation as to marital outrage. The case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her eventual estrangement from Henry II of England, which unfolded through the 1160s and culminated in Henry's imprisonment of Eleanor in 1173, while not strictly an adultery case, illustrates the way in which the politics of noble marriage and marital loyalty could become entangled with the politics of power and succession in ways that were potentially fatal for those caught in the middle. The evidence available to us from court records, literary sources, and chronicles of the period reveals that the man who loved a married woman was, in most cases, acutely aware of the dangers he was navigating. The elaborate conventions of courtly love poetry, which we will examine in a later section, were in part a cultural system for managing and aestheticizing exactly this kind of dangerous love, providing a literary framework within which the desire for a married woman could be expressed and celebrated in a coded and stylized form that acknowledged the impossibility of its consummation, while also refusing to simply suppress or deny the feeling. As we turn now to examine the social world of the peasantry, we will find that the consequences of illicit love took forms that were in many ways more immediate and more physically brutal than anything the nobility typically experienced. Peasant love and manorial justice, the unfree and their illicit hearts. The vast majority of the population of medieval Europe, somewhere between 70 and 80% in most regions during the high medieval period from roughly 1000 to 1300, was composed of peasant farmers, and a population that ranged from the relatively prosperous free tenant holding his land by a formal legal arrangement to the unfree serf, known in England as the villain, who was bound to the lord's manor by ties of personal legal dependency that made him, in the eyes of the law, something closer to a piece of property than a fully autonomous person. The legal and social consequences of illicit love for people at this level of society were in many ways the rawest and the most immediate, stripped of the aristocratic codes of honour and the expensive machinery of canonical legal proceedings, and reduced to the bluntest possible forms of community enforcement and economic punishment. The manor was, in the high medieval period, the basic unit of rural social organisation across most of northern and western Europe, and the manorial court, known in England as the hall mote or the court baron, was the primary legal forum in which the daily lives of the peasant population were regulated. These courts met typically 3 or 4 times a year, sometimes more frequently, in the great hall of the manor house or in a dedicated court building, under the presidency of the lord himself, or more commonly his steward, a professional administrator who managed the practical affairs of the estate. The proceedings of these courts were recorded in court rolls, written on long strips of parchment that were then rolled up and stored in the manorial archive, and a large number of these rolls survive, particularly for English manors from the 13th century onward, providing an extraordinarily detailed record of the lives of ordinary medieval people. The presentments of the manorial court, and meaning the matters that were brought before it for adjudication, included a very wide range of agricultural, legal and social matters, but among the most consistently present categories of business were the amercements or fines levied for various forms of sexual misconduct. The Lehrweit, mentioned briefly in an earlier section of our discussion, was the most common of these, and the court rolls of many English manors from the period show it being levied with considerable frequency. At the manor of Halesowen in Worcestershire, the court rolls from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, studied and published by the historian Zvi Razi in his detailed 1980 work Life, Marriage and Death in a Medieval Parish, show Lehrweit being imposed on unfree women at rates that suggest premarital and extramarital sexual activity was not uncommon in the village community. The fine itself was typically modest in monetary terms, amounting to a few pence in most cases, but its social significance was considerable because it was recorded publicly in the court roll and announced at the court session, effectively publishing the woman's offence to her entire community. More serious than the Lehrweit was the situation of the peasant woman who became involved with a married man, particularly if that man was the lord of the manor himself or one of his senior officials. The power differential in such situations was enormous and was rarely reflected in the legal record, which tended to treat the woman as the party at fault regardless of the circumstances. There are documented cases in the chronicles of the period, as well as in the records of ecclesiastical visitations, of manorial lords who systematically exploited the sexual vulnerability of unfree women on their estates, using their power over the women's legal status and their families' livelihoods to compel compliance with sexual demands. The canon law concept known as droit du seigneur or ius primae noctis, the alleged right of a lord to sleep with a serf woman on her wedding night before her husband did, is now regarded by most historians as a legal myth, rather than a widespread practical custom, but the underlying reality it mythologized, which was the genuine sexual vulnerability of unfree women to the demands of powerful men, was very much a real phenomenon documented in multiple sources. The peasant man who found himself in love with a married woman in his village faced a different but equally difficult set of social pressures. Village communities in medieval Europe were small, densely interconnected, and characterized by an intimacy of daily life in which virtually nothing remained private for long. A man known to be paying romantic attention to another man's wife was inviting not only the hostility of the wronged husband, but the organized disapproval of the entire community. The Charivari, a form of communal ritual shaming that was practiced across much of medieval France and appeared in related forms in other parts of Europe, was a particularly vivid demonstration of how communities enforced their sexual norms. When a marriage was perceived to have been violated, or when a couple was regarded as having transgressed the community's moral standards, the Charivari involved the gathering of neighbours, often at night, outside the offender's home, armed with pots, pans and other noise-making implements, to create a cacophony of sound intended to shame the transgressor publicly and demonstrate the community's collective disapproval. The Charivari could last for several nights running and was intensely humiliating for its target. Beyond the Charivari, a man known to be involved with a married woman could find himself subject to economic retaliation from the injured husband and his supporters. In the densely cooperative world of peasant agriculture, where neighbours depended on one another for assistance at harvest time, for the loan of oxen and ploughing equipment, and for 100 other practical necessities of rural life, being excluded from the networks of mutual cooperation could be economically devastating. A man whose neighbours refused to help him at harvest time, or who found himself unable to borrow the tools and animals he needed to farm his strip of open field land effectively, was in genuine economic danger in a world with very little margin for error. The social consequences of transgressing the community's sexual norms could thus translate directly and rapidly into material hardship of the most practical kind. As we turn our attention now to the specific cultural form that the medieval nobility developed to manage and aestheticize the impossible desire for a married person, we move into the remarkable world of courtly love, a tradition of poetry, music, social ritual that provides one of the most illuminating windows available to us into the emotional and imaginative life of the medieval aristocracy. Geography, confession, guild law, and the urban world, hidden lives in the medieval landscape. It is particularly worth considering in the context of the broader legal landscape we have been describing, how the specific geography of medieval Europe shaped the experience of those caught in illicit love. A peasant woman in the flat agricultural plains of the Beauce region of France, south of Paris, lived in a landscape of open fields and scattered villages where everything was visible and nothing was hidden. A landscape in which the movements and associations of every villager were known to every other villager, with an intimacy that made secrecy nearly impossible. By contrast, a woman living in the mountainous regions of the Pyrenees or the Alps, or in the forested highlands of Wales or the Scottish borders, had lived in a world where the topography itself afforded some measure of privacy, where a long walk up a hillside track or across a wooded ridge could place a person beyond the immediate observation of their neighbours in a way that was simply not possible on the open plains. The physical environment of medieval life shaped its social and emotional possibilities in ways that historians have only relatively recently begun to examine with the thoroughness they deserve. The seasonal rhythms of medieval agriculture also played a role in creating the conditions under which illicit relationships formed and were maintained. The long winter months, when agricultural work was minimal and people were confined to the village for extended periods with relatively little productive occupation, were the times when proximity and shared domestic space created conditions most favourable to the development of intimate relationships of all kinds, sanctioned and unsanctioned alike. The harvest season, by contrast, brought people together in the fields in conditions of intense communal labour that created both opportunities for casual contact between men and women who might not otherwise have spent much time together, and a degree of social relaxation in the celebratory atmosphere that followed the completion of the harvest. The autumn feast days and the winter festivals of the ecclesiastical calendar, particularly the 12 days of Christmas from the 25th of December through to the 5th of January, provided occasions when the normal rules of social interaction were somewhat loosened, and when the proximity of celebration and the warming effect of ale and wine created conditions that the Church's confessors' manuals regarded with considerable wariness. The confessors' manuals, known in Latin as the Summa Confessorum, were practical guides written for the use of parish priests in hearing confession, and they provide an extraordinarily detailed catalogue of the sexual sins that the medieval Church considered it necessary to identify and address in the confessional. The most influential of these manuals, including the Summa of Raymond of Pennafort, completed around 1234 and widely circulated throughout the following century, and the Summa of John of Freiburg, written in the 1290s, devote extensive attention to the sins of adultery, fornication and concubinage, specifying the circumstances that aggravated or mitigated these sins, the appropriate penances to be assigned for each, and the manner in which the confessor should question a penitent to ensure a full and honest disclosure of the nature and extent of the offence. The questioning protocols specified in these manuals are remarkable in their specificity. A confessor was advised to ask not merely whether the penitent had committed adultery, but with whom, how many times, in what places, and under what circumstances, whether there had been violence or coercion, whether the other party was also married, and whether the relationship had produced children. That this systematic and thoroughgoing questioning was designed to ensure that the priest understood the full moral weight of what had occurred, and could assign an appropriate penance, but it also meant that the confessional became, in effect, a systematic mechanism for gathering information about the sexual lives of the medieval laity, information that, while theoretically protected by the absolute seal of confession, must have shaped the priest's practical knowledge of and attitude toward the members of his parish in ways that were not always easy to disentangle from his official functions. The question of what happened to children born of the relationship between a lord and a serf woman deserves somewhat more detailed attention than we have yet given it. The children of such relationships occupied a legal position that was determined primarily by the status of the mother, under the rule known in the Latin of the period as partus sequitur ventrem, meaning that the legal condition of the offspring follows the condition of the womb, a rule that had its origins in Roman slavery law and had been incorporated into the medieval legal treatment of serfdom. This meant that even if the father of a child born to a serf woman was a free man, or even a noble or a lord, the child was still legally unfree if the mother was unfree. The lord who had fathered a child by one of his own female serfs was therefore in the paradoxical position of having fathered a child who was, in the eyes of the law, his own property. Lords chose to manumit, that is, formally free such children, granting them their liberty by a written document that specified the conditions of the grant and was witnessed by appropriate parties. Others simply ignored the question, allowing the child to grow up in the village community in the same legal condition as any other child of a serf, with no acknowledgement of the paternal relationship and no claim against the father. The records of manorial courts from the 13th and 14th centuries include cases in which the lord's interest in the legal status of specific individuals was called into question. And some of these cases involved the investigation of a person's parentage and the determination of whether they were entitled to claim free status on the basis of a free father, or whether the rule of partus sequitur ventrem meant that their mother's servile status determined their own. The role of the parish priest in the village community also deserves careful attention in the context of illicit love, because the priest occupied a uniquely ambiguous position in relation to the sexual transgressions of his parishioners. On the one hand, he was the church's representative in the village, tasked with maintaining the moral discipline of his community, reporting transgressions to the bishop's court, and administering the penances that the court imposed. On the other hand, he was also the person to whom those same parishioners made their confessions, and the absolute seal of confession meant that he could not use what he learned in that context in any official capacity. He was, in other words, simultaneously the moral enforcer and the confidential repository of the community's most intimate secrets. And the tension between these two roles must have been, for many priests, psychologically complex and practically awkward. The visitation records of dioceses across England and France from the 13th and 14th centuries include numerous cases in which parish priests are recorded as having known about adulterous relationships in their villages for extended periods without having reported them, and the reasons for this silence presumably varied widely, from genuine sympathy for the parties involved, to fear of the social consequences of denouncing a powerful parishioner, to the practical recognition that community harmony was sometimes better served by a discreet silence than by the destabilizing consequences of a formal prosecution. It is also worth examining with some care the situation of the medieval urban environment, and because the towns and cities of medieval Europe, particularly as they grew in size and complexity during the high and later medieval period, created social conditions that were in important ways different from those of the rural world we have been primarily discussing. The towns of 12th and 13th century Europe were densely packed communities in which people of many different social backgrounds, legal statuses, and geographical origins lived in close proximity, and the relatively greater anonymity of urban life, compared with the tightly known social world of the village, created conditions under which illicit relationships could sometimes be maintained with more discretion than was possible in the country. The urban courts, both ecclesiastical and secular, were correspondingly active in their prosecution of sexual misconduct, and the records of the city courts of places like Exeter, York, Paris and Bruges from the 13th and 14th centuries include large numbers of cases involving adultery, fornication, and the maintenance of concubines, reflecting both the genuine prevalence of such behaviour in the urban environment and the greater institutional capacity of the city to police it. The guild system of medieval towns also played a role in the regulation of sexual behaviour, because guild membership was a critical economic resource in the urban context, and guilds typically required their members to be of good moral character and could expel members whose behaviour brought the guild into disrepute. And a master craftsman known to be conducting an adulterous relationship risked not only ecclesiastical censure and the hostility of the injured spouse, but the loss of his guild membership, which in the highly regulated economic world of the medieval town could mean the loss of his ability to practice his trade at all. The records of guild courts and guild regulations from the 13th and 14th centuries include various references to the moral requirements of membership and to the procedures by which members could be disciplined or expelled for behaviour incompatible with the guild standards, and sexual misconduct, particularly adultery, features in a number of these records as a recognised ground for disciplinary action. We might also consider, in the context of the urban medieval world, the specific situation of the widow of a master craftsman, who in many guild traditions inherited the right to continue operating her late husband's workshop for a limited period or, in some cases, indefinitely, provided she conducted herself with appropriate decorum and did not remarry outside the guild. Such a widow, who might be a woman of considerable practical business ability and some economic independence, was also a woman in a peculiarly visible position within the guild community, where her behaviour was subject to scrutiny by the guild authorities as well as by the church courts and the civic government. If such a woman formed an attachment to a married man, perhaps a fellow guild member, the consequences could extend far beyond the personal and ecclesiastical dimensions to include the loss of her workshop rights, her membership in the guild community, and the economic livelihood that those rights provided. The intersection of gender, legal status, and economic position in the medieval urban world created, as we can see, a set of specific vulnerabilities for women that operated alongside and in addition to the more general vulnerabilities we have already described. The experience of the attempted to regulate the living arrangements and the social behaviour of the students, in part because of the frequency with which young scholars became involved with the wives of local townspeople, attracted perhaps by the relative sophistication and the apparent exciting foreignness of educated young men who were, at the same time, temporarily resident and therefore in a sense available in a way that settled married men were not. The records of the Paris courts from the 13th and 14th centuries include numerous cases of exactly this kind, and the tension between the university community and the town community of Paris over the question of which court had jurisdiction over students accused of various offences, including sexual misconduct, was a source of persistent friction throughout the medieval period. And it is worth resting for a moment in the texture of all this history, in the accumulated weight of all these specific details and documented cases and legal mechanisms, and recognising what they amount to collectively. They amount to evidence that the medieval world, for all its institutional severity and its religious framework of sin and punishment, was a world full of the same basic human experiences that fill every age. People fell in love with the wrong people. People found themselves caught between genuine feeling and institutional disapproval, between private longing and public obligation, between what they wanted and what the world around them would permit. And they navigated those contradictions with the resources available to them, sometimes successfully, more often not, always at some cost. And always in ways that reveal, beneath the formal surface of the legal and theological record, the persistent and irreducible reality of their humanity, courtly love, and the aesthetics of impossible desire. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider the remarkable cultural phenomenon known as courtly love, or fin amour in the Occitan of the troubadour poets, who first articulated it in the courts of southern France during the late 11th and early 12th centuries, because it represents one of the most sustained and sophisticated cultural responses to the specific problem we are examining tonight. Courtly love was, at its core, a literary and social system built around the desirability of loving a married woman, around the specific quality of desire that arises from its own impossibility, and around the ennobling effect that such desire was supposed to have on the man who experienced it. It was, in other words, a system for transforming the social disaster of loving someone you could not have into something aesthetically beautiful and morally elevating, and it was elaborated with extraordinary sophistication by the poets, musicians, and intellectuals of the medieval aristocracy. The troubadours, the lyric poets of Occitania, which is to say the southern French-speaking region that encompassed present-day Languedoc, Provence, and parts of northern Spain and northern Italy, began producing their distinctive vernacular love poetry in the late 11th century. The earliest troubadour whose work survives is generally identified as Guillaume IX, Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitiers, and who was born in 1071 and died in 1127, and who composed 11 surviving poems that establish with remarkable clarity the basic themes and conventions of the courtly love tradition. Guillaume was himself a man of considerable military and political significance, having participated in the Crusade of 1101 and governed one of the largest and most powerful territories in France. His poetry describes love in terms that are frankly sensual, and at the same time deeply complicated by the social conventions of the aristocratic world, a world in which the most desirable women were precisely those who were already married to other men of high rank. The central figure in the courtly love tradition was the domna, the lady, who was typically understood to be a married noblewoman of high rank, the poet-lover or troubadour, and expressed his love for the domna in terms of profound, consuming devotion that was explicitly modelled on the relationship between a feudal vassal and his lord. The lover described himself as the domna's man in the same way that a knight was his lord's man, pledged to serve her absolutely, to honour her will above his own, and to accept the obligations of this service without complaint regardless of how they were fulfilled or frustrated. The domna, in the classic formulation, was typically cold, distant and reluctant to grant her favours, and the lover was typically abject, devoted, and willing to accept even the smallest sign of encouragement as a reason for renewed hope and continued service. The reward that the lover sought was called the joy, and a word that carries the meaning of joy but has the specific connotation of the consummation of the love relationship, and the aspiration toward joy was supposed to elevate and refine the lover's character through the process of prolonged, patient, devoted, and usually unrequited desire. Andreas Capellanus, a chaplain believed to have worked at the court of Champagne in northern France in the late 12th century, wrote a Latin prose treatise known as De Amore, the full title of which translates as Concerning the Art of Courtly Love, which he dedicated to a certain Walter, and which purports to be a comprehensive guide to the theory and practice of courtly love. The work is fascinating for many reasons, but particularly for its explicit acknowledgement that the object of courtly love is, in the classic formulation, a married woman, and for its elaborate discussion of why this is supposed to be not a problem, but precisely the source of the tradition's moral and emotional value. Capellanus argues, drawing on earlier classical and Arabic sources as well as the contemporary troubadour tradition, that love within marriage is impossible because love requires free choice and the longing of desire, both of which are absent when physical access is guaranteed and legal obligation replaces personal devotion. This argument, whatever we may think of its logic, was a serious and sophisticated attempt to address the central paradox of the courtly love tradition, which was that the system it described was simultaneously the most elevated form of human emotional experience and a direct violation of the Church's most fundamental social institution. The courtly love tradition spread northward from Occitania during the 12th century, carried partly through the personal connections of the great southern noble families and partly through the extraordinary influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine, granddaughter of Guillaume IX, and one of the most politically and culturally significant figures of the 12th century. Eleanor, who was born around 1122 and died in 1204, was successively Queen of France as the wife of Louis VII and Queen of England as the wife of Henry II, and her court at Poitiers in the period from roughly 1168 to 1173, when she was effectively governing Aquitaine independently during her estrangement from Henry, became one of the great cultural centres of the age and a key site for the transmission and elaboration of the courtly love tradition into the French-speaking aristocratic world of Northern Europe. As we move now to examine the specific legal procedure of the ecclesiastical court in cases involving adultery and illicit love, we will find that the gap between the elegant literary world of the troubadours and the grinding, practical reality of medieval legal process was, for the people caught in that process, an extraordinarily wide and painful one. Documented cases, real lives caught between love and law. The historical record of medieval Europe is not silent on the specific documented experiences of individuals who found themselves in love with married people and who faced the consequences of that love in the real legal and social world of their time. While the most intimate and personal aspects of these relationships are inevitably lost to us, the court records, chronicles of scandals, episcopal registers, and occasionally the private letters that survive from the medieval period allow us to reconstruct a surprising number of specific cases in considerable detail. And those cases, taken together, give us a vivid and sometimes deeply moving picture of what this experience actually meant for real people living real lives in the medieval world. And one of the most extensively documented cases involving illicit love in the medieval period is the relationship between Peter Abelard and Eloise, which unfolded in Paris in the years between approximately 1115 and 1120. Abelard, born in 1079 in the town of Le Palais in Brittany, was by the time of his meeting with Heloise one of the most celebrated philosophers and theologians of his age, renowned throughout the schools of Paris for his brilliance as a dialectician and his extraordinary skill as a teacher. He had made his reputation in Paris by defeating the great Parisian teacher William of Champeaux in public debate on the question of universals, and he had established his own school on the hill of St. Genevieve that attracted students from across Europe. Heloise, born around 1100, was the niece of a canon of the Cathedral of Notre Dame named Fulbert, and she was herself a woman of remarkable intellectual gifts whose reputation for learning and Latin scholarship had spread through the Parisian scholarly community. It was through her uncle Fulbert that Abelard arranged to become her tutor, moving into Fulbert's house on the Ile de la Cité in Paris and undertaking her education in exchange for board. What followed was a love affair of extraordinary intensity and extraordinary consequence. Abelard and Heloise became lovers, and Heloise became pregnant, giving birth to a son whom they named Astrolabe. They married secretly to satisfy canon law and to protect Fulbert's honour, but the marriage remained concealed to protect Abelard's reputation and his career prospects in the church. Fulbert, furious at what he regarded as a betrayal of his trust and a dishonour to his family, arranged for a group of men to enter Abelard's lodgings one night and castrate him. The consequences for both parties were permanent and complete. Abelard retired to the monastery of St. Denis, eventually establishing a new school and continuing his theological work, but his career in the secular world was entirely destroyed. Heloise entered the convent of Argenteuil and eventually became prioress of the Paraclete, a religious community Abelard established for her. Their remarkable correspondence, exchanged in the years after their separation and preserved in manuscript form, gives us one of the most intimate and intellectually sophisticated accounts of the emotional reality of medieval love outside the bounds of sanctioned marriage that the period has left us. The case of Abelard and Heloise is, of course, exceptional in its intellectual and literary dimensions, but the basic structure of its consequences, the destruction of the man's public career, the compelled entry of the woman into religious life, the permanent separation of two people who had formed a genuine and profound emotional bond, is not exceptional at all. It reflects, in an unusually well-documented form, the kind of outcome that was available to the medieval ecclesiastical and social system as a means of resolving the problem of illicit love. The couple could not remain together in the open. They could not be allowed to continue their relationship without some form of institutional response, and the institutional response, when it came, was comprehensive and final. Moving further down the social scale, the court records of the Diocese of Ely in England, covering the late 13th and early 14th centuries, include numerous cases of ordinary men and women brought before the bishop's consistory court on charges of adultery and fornication, and these cases, while lacking the literary and philosophical dimensions of the Abelard and Heloise story, are in some ways more revealing of the typical experience because they are more typical. In a case from the register of Bishop William of Louth, dating from approximately 1295, a woman named Alice, described as the wife of a certain John the Miller of the village of Soham, was presented before the court on the allegation that she had been conducting an ongoing sexual relationship with a man named Robert the Carpenter of the neighbouring village of Wicken. Both Alice and Robert were required to appear before the court, were examined under oath, and were found guilty on the basis of the testimony of multiple witnesses from both villages who had observed them meeting repeatedly at specific locations outside the village boundaries. Alice was sentenced to stand penance at the church door of Soham on 4 consecutive Sundays. Robert was similarly sentenced and was additionally required to pay a sum of money to the court as a fine. John the Miller, Alice's husband, was granted a formal separation from bed and board on the grounds of his wife's adultery, though not a dissolution of the marriage, and Alice, separated from her husband and publicly shamed, disappears from the surviving records without any indication of what became of her. The records of the Parliament of Paris, the highest court in France, from the 13th and 14th centuries include cases involving adultery among the nobility that illustrate the way in which the intersection of political power, property rights and marital transgression could create situations of extreme legal complexity and personal danger. A case from 1310 in the Parliament's registers involves a Norman knight named Gilles de Monceau, who had been maintaining a relationship with the wife of a more powerful baron named Raoul de Bourgneuf. When the relationship was discovered, Raoul brought both a civil action before the Parliament and a canonical action before the diocesan court, seeking simultaneously the formal punishment of his wife's lover through the secular courts and the formal separation of his wife through the ecclesiastical courts. The parliamentary registers record the proceedings in considerable detail, including the testimony of servants who had observed the couple together, the examination of physical evidence in the form of letters exchanged between them, and the eventual judgment that Gilles was guilty and must pay a substantial financial penalty to Raoul, who was also granted the separation from his wife that he had sought in the ecclesiastical court. As we turn now to examine the specific situation of the remarried widow or widower who might have genuinely loved their dead spouse's successor, we enter a slightly different but equally revealing corner of medieval marital law and social expectation. Widowhood, remarriage, and the ghost of the first spouse's death was, of course, the one circumstance under which medieval canon law permitted the dissolution of a marriage bond and the legitimate formation of a new one. When a spouse died, the surviving partner was legally free to remarry, and the Church offered no theological objection to remarriage following genuine widowhood, provided the new marriage was contracted in accordance with canonical requirements and that the appropriate period of mourning had been observed. In practice, however, the social, economic and emotional reality of widowhood and remarriage in medieval Europe was considerably more complicated than this simple legal framework might suggest, and the situation of a widow or widower who had genuinely loved their first spouse, and who then found themselves developing feelings for a new partner who might have been connected in some way to the first marriage, could be fraught with exactly the kind of social and legal complications we have been examining throughout this discussion. Among the nobility, the remarriage of a widow was a matter of very considerable interest to the widow's lord, to her children from the first marriage, and to the extended family network on both sides of the original marital alliance. A noble widow held in many cases a significant body of property in the form of her dower rights, the one-third share of her late husband's estates to which she was entitled for her lifetime as part of the original marriage settlement. This dower property reverted to the heirs of the first marriage upon the widow's death, but during her lifetime it was hers to manage, and its management, together with the management of any property she might hold in her own right, made a noble widow a person of real economic significance. Her choice of second husband was therefore not a matter of purely personal concern. It directly affected the economic interests of her late husband's family, her own children, her lord, and potentially the crown itself. Under the feudal law of most medieval European kingdoms, a widow who held her dower as a tenant of the crown or of a great lord was required to obtain her lord's permission before remarrying. This requirement was not merely formal or honorary. A lord could refuse permission, or could grant it only upon payment of a very substantial fine known in England as the relief of marriage, and the income from these reliefs was a significant source of revenue for the crown and the great magnates. The Magna Carta of 1215, sealed by King John of England in the meadow at Runnymede on the 15th of June of that year, includes specific clauses addressing the situation of noble widows, reflecting how contested this area of law was and how strongly the noble class felt about the ability of the crown to control the remarriage of their widows and the disposal of their property. Clause 8 of the original Magna Carta states that no widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she prefers to live without a husband, provided she gives security that she will not marry without the king's consent, and this clause represents a genuine, if limited, the recognition that widows had some interest in making their own decisions about their futures. The emotional reality of widowhood in medieval Europe was, as one might expect, deeply varied, and the evidence available to us from letters, wills, and chronicle accounts suggests that genuine grief and genuine love were very much part of the emotional landscape of medieval marriages, even those that had been arranged for primarily economic reasons. The letters of Margaret Paston, an English gentlewoman of the 15th century whose extensive correspondence with her husband, John Paston, and with their children and associates constitutes one of the most remarkable private archives to survive from the medieval period, give us a vivid picture of a woman deeply invested in her husband's well-being and genuinely distressed when they were separated by his legal and political business in London. When John Paston I died in May of 1466, Margaret's subsequent letters reveal a woman managing her grief while simultaneously navigating the extremely complex legal and economic aftermath of her husband's death with considerable practical skill. The widow who fell in love with a married man in the period following her first husband's death occupied a particularly tragic position because she had experienced the freedom of genuine legal availability, had potentially formed a genuine emotional attachment, and then found herself confronted by the impossibility of the union she desired. There are documented cases in the ecclesiastical court records of widows who contracted informal unions with married men, presumably in the hope that the man's first marriage could somehow be dissolved or declared invalid, and who then found themselves before the court facing canonical penalties for their participation in what was, in law, an adulterous union regardless of the widow's own marital status. The canonical principle was clear. The widowed status of one party to an adulterous union was legally irrelevant. The crime was defined by the married status of the other party, and a widow who slept with a married man was, in the eyes of canon law, guilty of the same offence as if she had been married herself. Among the peasant population, the practical realities of widowhood were somewhat different but no less complicated in their emotional and social dimensions. A peasant widow who held her late husband's tenancy on the lord's manor occupied a legally precarious position, because in many medieval manorial customs the widow's right to continue holding the tenancy was contingent on her behaviour, her capacity to perform the required labour services, and often on her remarriage within a specified period to someone who could perform those services more effectively. A widow who chose to enter into an informal relationship with a married man rather than remarrying through the sanctioned channels could find herself facing not only ecclesiastical censure, but the loss of her home and her livelihood if the Lord chose to revoke her tenancy on the grounds of her immoral conduct. The pressures on widows to conform to community expectations of sexual propriety were thus economic as well as moral, and the consequences of failing to do so were correspondingly practical and severe. Quietly and without urgency, we now turn our attention to one of the most poignant aspects of this entire subject, which is the experience of those individuals who were themselves the children of illicit unions, born into a legal and social status that they had done nothing to create and had no power to change. The illegitimate child, born into law's indifference. There is something deeply restful in the thought that history, however distant and however harsh, is also the story of individual human beings navigating the world as best they can with the circumstances they were given. And this thought has particular force when we turn to consider the situation of the illegitimate child in medieval Europe, a person whose entire social and legal position in the world was determined not by anything they had done or chosen, but entirely by the circumstances of their parents' relationship. The child born of an adulterous union, or a relationship between unmarried people, was described in the legal language of the period as spurious, nothus, or bastardus. The three terms with slightly different connotations, but all conveying the same fundamental legal reality. This child had no legal father, no claim to inherit in the ordinary way, and no place in the formal structures of family, property, and social organisation that govern the lives of legitimate children. The specific legal disabilities attaching to illegitimacy in medieval Europe varied somewhat by a region and by legal tradition, but certain consequences were nearly universal across the canonical and secular legal systems of the period. In the realm of inheritance, the basic rule under both Roman-derived law and the Germanic customary laws that had shaped the legal traditions of Northern Europe was that an illegitimate child could not inherit from its father. The legitimate heirs of the father, whether children of a valid marriage, her brothers or more remote relatives, took precedence in all circumstances, and the illegitimate child's claim was simply not recognised. This rule had its most dramatic consequences in the context of noble families, where inheritance determined not merely personal wealth but political power, territorial authority, and social rank. The illegitimate son of a great magnate, however personally capable and however publicly acknowledged by his father, stood in a legally and politically inferior position to even a much less capable legitimate heir. And the history of medieval Europe is in part the history of the consequences of this fundamental asymmetry. Under canon law, illegitimacy created a further set of disabilities in the context of ecclesiastical career. A man of illegitimate birth could not, but without a specific papal dispensation known as a legitimation, be ordained to the priesthood or hold any ecclesiastical office. This disability was practically significant because the church was one of the primary avenues of social advancement available to men of lower social status or uncertain family background, and the closure of that avenue to illegitimate men represented a genuine restriction on their life possibilities. The requirement for a papal dispensation meant that a sufficiently wealthy family could in principle obtain one for an illegitimate son they wished to place in the church, and the papal registers from the 12th century onward include numerous dispensations of this kind, granted for substantial payments to the papal treasury. But for the illegitimate son of a peasant or a minor artisan, and the expense of obtaining such a dispensation was entirely out of reach. The social stigma of illegitimacy, which operated alongside and reinforced the legal disabilities, was experienced differently at different levels of the social hierarchy. At the highest levels, among the royal and great noble families, illegitimacy was a serious but not always fatal handicap. As we have already noted, William the Conqueror was himself an acknowledged bastard who nevertheless inherited the Duchy of Normandy and conquered England. The illegitimate children of medieval kings were sometimes given titles, lands, and positions of considerable influence, particularly when their legitimate siblings were too young or too weak to provide effective governance. Henry I of England's illegitimate son, Robert of Gloucester, who was born around 1090 to an unknown mother, became the most powerful magnate in England during the civil war of the 1130s and 1140s known as the Anarchy, fighting on behalf of his half-sister Empress Matilda against King Stephen. Robert's illegitimacy did not prevent him from being a man of enormous military and political significance, though it did ensure that he could never himself claim the throne. At the lower levels of medieval society, the stigma of illegitimacy was more uniformly experienced and more practically damaging. A peasant child known to be illegitimate, known to be the product of the village blacksmith's relationship with a neighbour's wife, for example, grew up in a community where that fact was well known, frequently discussed, and permanently attaching. The child might be excluded from inheritance of the family tenancy, might find their social prospects constrained in very practical ways, and might carry the social stigma of their origins throughout their life in ways that were both painful personally and practically limiting. The records of manorial courts include cases in which the question of a person's legitimate or illegitimate status was directly relevant to their legal rights and obligations, and the determination of this question could turn on evidence as intimate and specific as the testimony of neighbours about the sleeping arrangements and known movements of the parents in the months preceding the child's birth. The Church's attitude toward illegitimate children was not simply one of condemnation, and it is worth acknowledging the ways in which canonical law and ecclesiastical practice attempted to mitigate the harshest consequences of the illegitimacy rules. Canon law held that the baptism of an illegitimate child was no different from that of a legitimate one, and that the child bore no personal sin for the circumstances of its birth. Illegitimate children who had been publicly legitimized, either through the subsequent marriage of their parents or through a specific act of papal or royal legitimation, recovered their full legal status and were treated thereafter as if they had been born in lawful wedlock. And the Church's orphanages and foundling hospitals, while not exclusively serving illegitimate children, provided at least a minimal institutional response to the problem of abandoned children born of illicit unions. That let us now turn our attention to the final section of our examination, which addresses the question of what happened to the emotional bonds that illicit love created when the full weight of the legal and social machinery of the medieval world came down upon them. The weight of the impossible, how people endured, escaped and remembered. It is important to understand, before we draw our exploration of this subject toward its gentle conclusion, that the medieval people whose lives we have been examining throughout this discussion were not simply passive objects being acted upon by the law, the church, and the social machinery of their communities. They were human beings with the full range of human capacities for feeling, for resistance, for creative response to impossible circumstances, and for finding within the constraints of their world what small freedoms and what private consolations were available to them. The history of illicit love in medieval Europe is not only the history of prosecution and punishment, it is also the history of evasion, of resilience, and of the quiet persistence of human emotional life in the face of institutional disapproval. And understanding that dimension of the history gives us a fuller and more truthful picture of what it actually meant to love someone you were not permitted to love in the medieval world. The most common form of evasion was simply the maintenance of secrecy, and the evidence of the court record suggests that a very large number of illicit relationships in medieval Europe were conducted for extended periods without official detection. The visitation records of medieval dioceses, which represent the most systematic attempts of the ecclesiastical authorities to uncover sexual misconduct in their jurisdictions, consistently reveal cases of relationships that had been ongoing for years or even decades before they came to official attention. And in some cases, the court records note explicitly that the relationship had been common knowledge in the local community, but that no formal complaint had been made, suggesting that communities sometimes exercised a form of collective discretion about which of their members' private transgressions they chose to bring to official attention and which they preferred to leave undisturbed. This selective enforcement of community norms reflected a complex set of social calculations in which the severity of the offence, the social status of the parties involved, the existence of other grievances between community members, and the current political relationship with the local lord or the diocesan authorities all played a role. Flight was another response available to those who found themselves in impossible situations. The medieval world was, and despite its many barriers to movement, not without the possibility of geographical escape for those desperate enough to attempt it. A man who had become involved with a married woman and who faced the threat of serious physical violence from her husband, or a woman who had been discovered in an adulterous relationship and who faced the prospect of being thrown out of her home and community, could in principle simply leave. The towns and cities of medieval Europe, particularly the growing urban centres of the high medieval period, such as Paris, London, Cologne, Florence and Venice, absorbed enormous numbers of migrants from rural areas throughout the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries, and the relative anonymity of urban life offered a degree of shelter from the specific personal consequences of a scandal in a particular village or manor. The canonical rule that a marriage could not simply be abandoned did not prevent people from physically removing themselves from the vicinity of the injured spouse, and while the canonical prohibition on remarriage continued to apply, the practical difficulty of maintaining surveillance over a person who had moved to a distant city meant that some people did, in practice, manage to construct new lives in new places, however illegally, in the eyes of the church. The emotional consequences of illicit love, for those who lived through them, are perhaps the most difficult aspect of this history to access with any confidence, because emotional experience is the thing that the historical record captures least reliably. But some documents do allow us a partial glimpse into the interior lives of medieval people caught in impossible loves. The letters of Heloise, written to Abelard years after their forced separation, are among the most honest and searching expressions of sustained romantic and sexual longing in the medieval literary record. In one of her letters, Heloise describes with characteristic directness the persistence of her physical desire for Abelard, despite her years in the convent, the way in which memories of their time together would intrude upon her even in the middle of the Mass, and the depth of the emotional wound inflicted by their separation. These letters were written not for publication but as private correspondence, and their extraordinary candour reflects the fact that Heloise was writing to the only person in the world to whom she could speak with complete honesty about her experience. The chansons de geste and the romance literature of the 12th and 13th centuries, while fictional in their specific narratives, draw on emotional realities that their aristocratic audiences recognised and responded to as genuine, and the persistence of themes of adulterous love in this literature suggests that the experience it described was not simply a literary convention, but a reflection of actual emotional life in the medieval aristocratic world. The story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which achieved its most elaborate development in the prose Lancelot of the 13th century French Arthurian cycle, and the story of Tristan and Isolde, and which was told in multiple versions by poets including Beroul and Thomas of Britain in the late 12th century, both turn on exactly the situation we have been examining tonight, the devastating love between a person of high worth and someone already bound to another by the most solemn of obligations. What is significant about both stories is not merely that they dramatise the suffering that follows from such love, but that they present the love itself as genuine, profound, and worthy of serious artistic attention, in pointed contrast to the official position of the Church that adultery was simply sin, and the emotional experience of the adulterer was simply temptation to be resisted. The long memory of medieval communities, the way in which the stories of local scandals were preserved and repeated in village oral tradition, and in the gossip of the marketplace and in the formal records of the courts, created another kind of enduring consequence for those who had loved beyond the boundaries of the permitted. A woman known to have been convicted of adultery in the bishop's court in 1280 might find that reputation following her for the rest of her life, and indeed being transmitted to her children and grandchildren as a defining family story. The records of the period contain references to families known by nicknames derived from the scandalous behaviour of an ancestor, a grim reminder that in the dense social world of the medieval community, nothing was ever truly forgotten, and the consequences of a moment of transgression could reverberate across generations. And yet, despite all of this, and despite the legal machinery and the theological condemnation and the social stigma and the practical consequences ranging from public humiliation to physical violence and financial ruin, the evidence of the court records, the chronicles, and the literary tradition of the medieval period makes absolutely clear that people continued, throughout the entire span of the medieval centuries, to fall in love with people they were not permitted to love, to form attachments that the church and the secular law regarded as entirely unacceptable, and to live with the consequences of those attachments in ways that were sometimes catastrophic and sometimes quietly ordinary, and sometimes, in their own private dimension, genuinely beautiful. The human capacity for love, in other words, was not successfully regulated by even the most thorough and determined institutional effort to contain it, and the history of the medieval attempt to do so is, in the end, as much a history of human feeling as it is a history of law and theology. It is, in the most gentle and unhurried way, a history that speaks to something permanent in human experience. If you are finding this exploration of love, law, and heartbreak in the medieval world to be a calm and helpful companion for rest or study tonight, a quiet like on the video is always genuinely appreciated, and it helps others who are looking for this kind of peaceful, detailed historical content to find the channel. Subscribing is the very best way to ensure you never miss a new exploration, and we do release new videos regularly on medieval history, ancient Rome, Viking history, and beyond. We would be very glad to hear in the comments which aspect of tonight's subject stayed with you most, and which historical periods or topics you would most like to explore in a future video. There is a great deal more medieval history still to cover together, and your suggestions genuinely shape where we go next. Tonight we have moved together through a very large territory, and it is worth pausing to gather the threads of what we have covered before we settle finally into rest. We began by examining the precise legal and theological framework of medieval marriage itself, the complex intersection of ecclesiastical canon law and secular property law that made marriage not merely a personal arrangement but a vast institutional structure carrying the full weight of church, crown and community. We looked in detail at how the doctrine of marital indissolubility operated in practice, and at the machinery of the ecclesiastical courts that enforced it, From the bishop's consistory court through the appeals procedure all the way to Rome, we examined the profoundly unequal position of men and women before this system, and the particular vulnerability of women, both wives who strayed and women who fell in love with married men, to consequences ranging from loss of legal standing to permanent social ruin. We looked at the extraordinary hypocrisy that characterized the Church's treatment of noble adultery in comparison with its treatment of the same behavior among the common people, and at the way in which the troubadour tradition of courtly love represented a remarkable cultural response to the problem of desiring what could not be legitimately obtained. We examined specific documented cases from the historical record, from the famous and heartbreaking story of Abelard and Heloise, to the quieter, less remembered cases preserved in the court rolls and episcopal registers of English and French dioceses. And we considered the situation of the children born into the consequences of these impossible loves, and the many ways in which medieval people found, within the constraints of their world, small measures of endurance, evasion, and private emotional survival. The history we have been examining tonight is, in the larger sense, a history of the permanent tension between the institutional forms that human societies create to organize and protect themselves, and the equally permanent human reality of emotional life that consistently exceeds and overflows those forms. The medieval church and the secular law of the medieval world were not simply cruel or irrational in their treatment of illicit love. They were attempting, with the tools and the beliefs available to them, to maintain a social order that depended on the clarity of property rights, legitimate inheritance, and the social stability of the household. The people caught in the consequences of that order were not, for the most part, revolutionaries or cynics. They were ordinary human beings experiencing the oldest and most ordinary of all human experiences, which is the experience of loving someone deeply, and finding that love in conflict with everything the world around them demands. We are grateful, as always, for your patient and gentle company on this long journey through the medieval past. It is a privilege to spend these quiet hours in the company of people who find something valuable in the careful, unhurried examination of lives lived long ago and far away from us. The medieval world, for all its harshness and its distances from our own, it was made up of people who loved, who hoped, who feared, and who endured in ways that are not as foreign to us as the centuries between us might suggest. In that continuity, there is something quietly comforting. Sleep gently with that thought. Good night, and sleep well.